everybody. I am Cassidy. I'm the hippie Catholic. Welcome to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe to be part of the conversation. I am here with my lovely friend Liz Waite. Liz is an actor and also interned at the Catholic Worker. So could you tell us a bit about yourself, Liz?
Hi, I'm Liz Waite. I am an actress, and I'm also a community justice social, organizer and all of that. I interned at the Catholic Worker in Boyle Heights in Los Angeles. I'm very much immersed within, church culture. I'm a convert. I converted in 2016. I started studying in 2014.
That's awesome. I am really excited to have Liz on the channel because Liz is another left Cath. For those of you who are not initiated to the Catholic shitposting world, yeah, we swear on the hippie Catholic. So left Cath stands for left-leaning Catholic or progressive Catholic. You can find left Caths on Twitter, on kind of any social media platform. But they're kind of very niche, and I kind of just really love this community, so I kind of want to just spread awareness about it more. My two questions, which you kind of like talked about like a little bit earlier, was like, how did you become a Catholic, and then how did you become a leftist?
Becoming a Catholic was interesting. So I grew up in like a mainstream, I guess, Baptist denomination. And when I started growing up and I was starting to learn more about, I guess, world history within the context of imperialism and any other unsavory things like that, I kind of gravitated away from religion for a little bit because I didn't like the associations there. I found them very troubling. The difference between the praxis and the actual history of the church as established in the modern era was very disturbing to me. I'm a very existential kind of person. I'm very thought-based and question-based. And I never found atheism tenable. I never found it to be a coherent worldview, or I never found it to be necessarily a good basis for a coherent worldview. I rejected materialism. None of it really added up to something that made sense to me. And I think on some innate level, I have always seen the order of the world, even in its fallen state, as analogous to the idea in the mind of God. So I met a neighbor, and she was Baptist during a really difficult time in my life. And she had C.S. Lewis on her shelf. Of course, it's, basic bitch shit. C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity. It's the, but I was very fascinated by it just because of the insistence he had on this kind of intellectual rigor and objectivity, and this emphasis on total detachment from reward. Like, he said that he wanted to make sure that he didn't convert because he wanted some kind of treat at the end of life, or he wasn't doing it in exchange for something. And I found that kind of rigor and objectivity very convicting. And he pointed out some things about the Trinity is too weird for human beings to make up. And I thought about that, and I'm like, you're correct. That is way too weird for anybody to think of. That is so counterintuitive that, it's more counterintuitive than any counterintuitive thing we could think of. He mentioned things like the fact that Christ was either a lunatic or he was a cult leader, a very malicious cult leader, unfathomably malicious, or he was God. And there isn't a fourth option for somebody who is claiming to be God himself. And other people have said things like, oh, he's a myth. And I'm like, no, that's ridiculous. There's been a number of religions that have had stories about demigods or avatars or anything like that, but they don't claim to be the source itself so much as either a manifestation of it or, they're contingent beings is the point. Christ is not a contingent being. So what he's claiming is it's so mind-blowingly strange that he's like, that's not something that you can just make up. First off, offhand, you couldn't even make it up yourself. And secondly, if somebody did, give me a break. They're not, that guy is either terribly malicious or they're God. They don't have any sort of gray intent there. And I was like, okay, all of these things are true. I can't argue with them. I find them all to be 100% true. And he's like, if it's the true religion, then it's going to be weird. It's not going to be something that you expect. It's going to subvert expectations. It's going to break expectations. It's going to set new expectations that you didn't even previously into it. And I'm like, that actually makes a terrible amount of sense. So I started going to church and like mainline Protestant, whatever. And I just found it really intellectually empty. I mean, it's not as if there aren't a number of, very sincere and good-hearted people in those churches. I just found that the emphasis was, once again, it didn't amount to something coherent or workable for the more difficult problems of existence. And I was frustrated because those churches always had this weird emphasis on the Old Testament, but always in the wrong way, like not in a Christological way, just in like let's go into the details of how these people killed a lamb during this particular thing, and then they never contextualized it. And it was like, hey, let's mimic Hanukkah, or let's mimic Passover. And I'm like, whoa, why are you? You're not a Jew. Why are you doing that? Like, you're not. Why are you acting like you're in the Old Testament if you follow a new covenant? I don't understand what you're doing. I don't see the point of it. And then it always was followed by like this kind of ingratiating of the homophobia and the in-out mentality of morality. I'm bi, like I'm super queer, so I was just like, I'm not vibing right now. Something's not adding up here. I had somebody in my life, a mentor, just be like, hey, look at the Catholic Church. They're way smarter, and they're very indelicate language. They're much smarter. And I did, and I was like, okay, well, I've concluded on a number of levels that this is counterintuitive in the way that the true religion would be counterintuitive, but it's filled with all of these great tensions and dichotomies of like the Eucharist, of like you're gonna eat the Eucharist like you're a hungry animal, like the language that Jesus used originally, like you're gonna gnaw on my body, but it's also something that's very almost mundane. Like you go to church, you go to mass on Sundays, and it's almost like a mundane thing. And these two tensions are embodied in that. And I'm like, well, that sounds like the kind of thing the kind of religion that actually does have existence enveloped into it. And in terms of the homophobia, where I was going, there was just no emphasis on that. And I mean, my research and understanding of it was that where there is, a lot of binary things that I think we need to work out, there's also a tremendous amount of untapped mysticism there that challenges it. That there is actually more room in the Church of Rome, surprisingly, to move and play around than you would expect.
Well, and I had kind of a similar experience with, like, I'm a cradle Catholic, but I consider myself a revert because I kind of fell away from practicing like in my teen years and into my early college years. But then later in my college experience, that was when I kind of started the hippie Catholic and stuff. And I started the hippie Catholic because it was kind of a response to my reversion experience, because I was learning so much about the church and I just had this passion for it that was like new. And I found all these Catholic bloggers and I just was like, I want to create with this. It was like the most weird, spontaneous thing, but it was just like kind of felt like a calling. So I just kind of followed it. And but yeah, something that I found about like a lot of the evangelical circles I was in, they would emphasize the Old Testament too, but in like a very appropriative way, like, and they would never invite any like Jewish like scholars or anybody, and that was always so bizarre.
It's a weird, it just makes you feel kind of icky. It's like you're acting like you love Jews, maybe Jewish people. I don't want to sound irreverent. Like you're acting like you love Jewish people, but in this really weirdly fetishizing kind of way. Like they're a good totem, or like the Old Testament's a good totem. Like it's and you're kind of building a weird cult around it without actually respecting the Jewish nation as our forefather. You know what I mean? Not actually respecting them Christologically, because you can have a deep love and respect and reverence for the Jewish people being the chosen people that brought the Messiah, but also like from our perspective, it's like these things were pointing towards the coming of the true king. Because otherwise, I mean, if you're looking at it, there are things there that if you're not reading it Christologically, it is horrible stuff. It was stuff written from a culture that was under siege. They were a lot of it, not a lot of it, but parts of it are reactionary against having your identity subsumed and destroyed. So, but also because religious texts function on multiple levels, like most texts do, these things can also be read as analogous to the coming of Christ and his purpose in relation to the church.
Something about the evangelical circles that I was in that also irritated me was they almost acted as if the Jewish people like don't exist anymore.
Kind of like how people act like towards the indigenous.
Yeah, it very, very.
They're a really cool concept that we can pillage, but they're not here anymore, so it's fine. But it's
So
like, no, they are here. They are here. It's alive. No matter how many times you think that it's been buried or dead, like they're alive. The Jewish people are alive. The indigenous are alive. These are customs that are living and breathing right now.
It's almost like people like have like this like strange sense of like, if only like, oh, too bad that they don't exist anymore. And it's like, they literally do. Like, if you cared enough, you could like, I don't know, send them a message or something. Thank you for sharing your like Catholic testimony, but like, how have you integrated your Catholic identity with your political ideation?
I grew up in like a super conservative background and it was really bad. And then I think part of it was, this is very funny, but it's also a good story about how the internet is so influential to people's political development. I spent a lot of time on Tumblr nearly to that 2010s, like many people did. The more that I was listening to this, more I was like, wow, okay, people our age were starting to point out the contradictions, the unresolvable difficulties in what we've been taught and how they no longer function and work for us, for our thriving. So I kind of became like a rad lib, quote unquote, like capitalism's okay, you know, if everybody has all their needs met. And then over time you start realizing, no, that's not how capitalism works. If everyone had their needs met, it wouldn't be capitalism. That's the point. It functions the opposite of that. In the online shitposting Catholic community that we're in, you know, I got a lot of exposure to people in South America, people in Mexico, people in the Philippines, but really primarily people in South America, and just their like the anger that they expressed towards America like shocked me at first. But then the more that I was listening and discoursing with them, I learned, you know, about all the horrifying things we've done. It was constantly, you know, these people from this global perspective, from the global South, were pointing out like, you know, you guys, you Americans, you're so limited in your view. You think that if you have a social democracy, that's going to solve all of your problems. But do you understand where your money is coming from? Do you understand where you're extracting that wealth? It's not just from your own people. It's from us. You're taking from us. And then, you know, I started reading more theory and more praxis, and then my own life experiences. You know, I'm $50,000 in debt, and I've struggled with homelessness, and I've seen firsthand the contradictions of capitalism, and what Marx has pointed out about that line in the Communist Manifesto, which I've always found so just mystically potent, like everything solid melting into air. All of these contradictions, all of these false idols that we've erected are just beginning to melt into the air, and nothing is making sense anymore because our whole frameworks, they're no longer tenable, and they were never meant to last anyways. They were meant to be set up for a certain amount of time, trick people and coerce them into cooperating with them, and then once people have made bank, they take their money and they run and they leave you in a wasteland, basically. So that was basically what made me a lib left, you know, a libertarian, anarchist, communist. You know, a lot of my stuff actually does vibe very much in practice with the Catholic worker, the communitarian personalism.
Yeah, that's something that I really loved about like the Catholic worker. From everything that I've learned about it, is just like the personalism, and like the concept of personalism is so compelling, and it's so in line with the gospel. I think that people get caught up on that Marx himself was against religion.
Marx was condemning a heresy. Marx was condemning a heretical view of Christianity that omitted the part of the Lord's Prayer that said on earth as it is in heaven. Because when you take that, since the tenets of the faith and the praxis of the faith are summarized and embodied within the Lord's Prayer, that means that heaven is not something that we just get to yearn for in this shitty, fucked up life and then we die. You know, like, it's okay if the poor are miserable now, they'll be the first in heaven. And it's like, no, that's not it. It's literally the eschaton is being brought here every single moment that we are acting in the spirit. We're bringing an apocalypse. The world is being reordered now in its present state. So he wasn't anti-religion. He was anti a very specific Christian heresy, and rightfully so.
Especially like that heresy in particular, it was cultivated like in the Middle Ages to kind of keep the peasants within their place, like, and for Christian lords and, you know, nobles and stuff to like feel justified in what they were doing, because they could be like, oh well, like it's okay, like yeah, I have my wealth now, but you know, like my peasants will get to heaven before me, so I guess it's fine.
Like Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, you know, they were so mad at her for what she was doing. You know, I mean, talk about a commie icon, right? Like she was just giving away all of her shit. She's just like, I can't stand to hold on to these things. Christ died for me. How can I stand to hold on to one item when there's people suffering? When Christ gave his whole body and soul and mind to me on a cross. And I mean, she was exposing she was calling their bluff, basically. She was exposing them. And they were so pissed. They tried, if I'm not mistaken, they tried to have her killed, or they just threw her out in the whatever. It was going to inspire like a peasant revolt, the way they treated her. So they just gave her like a little cottage that she could live in, like, you know, like a kind of monastic poverty in. But like, yeah, she was calling their bluff. That's really a lot of what Christ did, was call people's bluffs, who were comfortable and who were, you know, just didn't want things to be didn't want things getting a little too rocky, people getting a little too discontent. You know, that's what he did. He came in there and he just started really upsetting that stuff. And I don't want to put Christ in a box, you know what I mean? Like Depeche Mode, like we've all got our own personal Jesus. We want to actually reach for the real thing. I don't want to put him in a political box. I find it impossible to separate the political from the personal from the heavenly. He was absolutely disrupting something on a very fundamental, mystical, but also socioeconomic level. And it functions on all of those levels.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I think that like something, I know that like you worked for like the Catholic Worker, and the Catholic Worker was founded by Dorothy Day, who was an anarchist and a pacifist. I know that something about Dorothy Day was that she kind of agitated everywhere she went. Like she never entered a space and felt like she had to behave. Like she always would be calling into question, like, hey, why are you doing that? Hey, why are you doing this? She really is like a model for like what like left-leaning Catholicism in the United States at least should look like. I guess like I'm gonna segue that into like, what do you wish that Catholics knew more about leftist politics? Because there is, you know, the left has been so demonized by the traditionalist Catholic movement. For those of you who don't know, because I know that I have a lot of people who are not Catholic who watch this channel, the traditionalist movement tends to be, you know, the kind of Catholics that you see mostly on the internet. They're like really, really pro-Trump. They're against a thing called Vatican II, which was a council that reinvigorated the church in the 1960s. It's a valid council. They tend to not really like Pope Francis very much.
They don't think he's the Pope. The problem, I guess, in America generally is that we're so deprived of any sort of global perspective on anything. We lack perspective politically, socially, in just such a number of ways. It's like, where do you even start? What I would start with, you know, more or less about the left is you need to let go of the things that have been the kind of buzzwords and buzz lines that have been put in your head about like communism killed 100 million people. And it's like, look, this thing called history, and it's called actually learning about history and learning about, once again, history's contradictions and failures. I'm not saying like 100 million people dead is a good thing. I'm not saying that I like Mao Zedong. I'm not an authoritarian communist. I'm not a tanky. I find that abhorrent, actually. A lot of that kind of state mandated stuff. But really, it's really, I would say, read Marx and interrogate it for the mystical impulse. Try to read between the lines and see the mystical impulse and what Marx is doing. Kind of compare notes to what Christ was saying, especially read Marx on the subject of religion, because he says it's the opiate of the masses, but like, you know, I mean, that once again, it's functioning on multiple levels. An opiate is a painkiller. Sometimes it saves people's lives. And, you know, he also said that it's the sigh of the oppressed. It's the cry of suffering against suffering. So I'm really saying, like, read Marx and try to contextualize what the Marxist impulse is in terms of the eschatological vision of Christ that he was articulating. Try to decipher that for yourself apart from any sort of propaganda and whatever. And also just please keep in mind that like actual hardcore leftists don't have any power in America, and they never have. I mean, don't get me wrong, like anarchists and communists are the reasons why we have unions and why we have weekends. But like there's no actual communist in American politics. That's ludicrous. It's absurd. We're a very, very right skewed country. So please keep that in mind when you're reading about communism or leftism in general.
I think that's something that a lot of people need to realize, is that like most of the Catholic media sources that are on the internet in particular are very, very skewed towards the traditionalist movement. And the traditionalist movement has a lot of like conspiracy theories within it. Like one of them like has to do with like the mysteries of Fatima, which Fatima is one of my favorite like Marian apparitions. Actually, don't take what I'm about to say as like a diss to Fatima. That's not what I'm saying. I feel like that the traditionalist movement can take Fatima really out of context.
But they emphasize the unspeakable, terrifying aspects of Fatima. And also, I mean, basically, I mean, I'm not going to say they're not Catholics because, you know, they have their baptism and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, really what they're functioning as are like, you know, right-wing evangelical infiltrators in the church, because they don't respect the Pope as the Pope. They indulge in doomsday ideology.
They keep talking about like this leftist infiltration into the church. And like, I have been around the internet. Okay. I have been around like Catholic circles, and the closest thing to a Catholic infiltrator I have found are like my my leftist shit posting friends that are Catholic.
Accusation is a form of confession.
Again, this isn't to say that like all communism has been helpful. This isn't to say that all communism is aligned with the teaching of Christ. This isn't to say that communism hasn't hurt people, because I've spoken to people that has family members that have been hurt by communism.
Oh yeah, like people that have escaped, you know, I have a friend on Facebook who's a communist, and she said like, I'm a communist, but I'm really sick of hearing people and like Americans, white Americans, idolizing Mao Zedong because my family almost starved to death. What we're saying is you need to start taking a global perspective on these issues and really start listening to people, the communist takes from people in South America, from Black dissidents in America, from all over the world, from these people that have had to battle the beast of the American empire, and also from the indigenous too, the indigenous Marxists who critique and update the canon and stuff like that. Indigenous stuff can sometimes, they've pointed out that there's stuff that to Marx that is foreign to the worldview of certain indigenous tribes and societies, but they're also altering the canon. They're also contributing to it.
Yeah, I've always like found that liberation theology in particular was like a really compelling theology, like when paired with Catholic social teaching, because Catholic social teaching is such a gift and it's so radical. Honestly, Catholic social teaching is one of the reasons why like I reverted to being a Catholic, or like a practicing Catholic, I should say, because I didn't stop being a Catholic, but you know, I became a practicing Catholic again. And I think something that just upsets me, and part of why I wanted to do this interview with you, was like, I just really hate when like the Catholic Church in particular gets pigeonholed into like, oh, you have to be this certain way to be Catholic. Like, and especially like we see that with like the traditionalist movement, since they have kind of like the monopoly on like Catholic media sources on the internet, like a lot of the new converts are rad trads or trads, you know. I can respect like aspects of the traditionalist movement. I have trad friends, but I just think that it's just really dishonest to pretend like that other kinds of Catholics like don't exist, or they're not true Catholics. Or like for example, I have friends that like I wanted to take them to mass with me at like a more moderate or progressive leaning parish, and they'll be like, oh no, I don't want to go there, like I'm afraid, because they see like all of the, quite frankly, like, you know, extremist stuff that's being spewed by like rad trads on the internet. And like that's just, I think I just get irritated with misinformation that keeps getting like spread around.
I mean, that's really such a tragic thing. Like I have a friend who's Orthodox, and she said like, you know, when she leaves church or whatever, that she literally will cover herself going to her car because she doesn't want ortho bros harassing her. trying to get her to like marry them like on the spot or whatever. These, the Orthodox unfortunately have their own version of rad trads. Catholicism in particular has a very legalistic bent, unfortunately, which the Orthodox have criticized us for. And the legalism, unfortunately, attracts people that want to run away from the tensions of life and just have everything solved, and want to feel superior and want to cling to that kind of certainty. The difficulty really is that mysticism is actually entering into the mystery of the Trinity, the mystery of the Virgin, the saints, her son, is one in which those tensions in life, those tensions within ourselves that cause us great anxiety, we don't actually run from them, nor do we necessarily resolve them, but we actually go deeper into them. That's an act of faith. It's an act of faith. Faith is in some sense both the opposite of certainty and the truest form of certainty, that you're going into these difficulties and these tensions of life regarding everything, sex and money and our spirituality and our the meaning of our existence and the meaning of all of these different various facets of creation. And you're not doing it for an answer, but you're doing it on trust. You're doing it on trust because you have evaluated the truth value of what this faith is taught, and you've determined that this is the true faith, and then you walk forward on that. The rad trad movement is just, it's a sickening, sad sight, and I'm particularly like a little hard bitten about it because I've been attacked by trads in a way that was like, I said like maybe we should take more of like an orthodox position towards birth control and NFP or whatever, as opposed to like mandating it. And I was called a sexual libertine. It was insinuated that I was an infiltrator trying to lead people away from God. I've had trads straight up say that I was a witch using the internet to negatively influence and hex and curse people, particularly upright, young, standing trad men away from God. Just like really ugly, which is like when you're a Catholic, that is actually damaging, because it's like that is not even attack. That's not even an attack on me. That's an attack on the sacraments. Like, you don't get to invalidate my sacraments and say that I'm not really Catholic because you didn't like my take. The woman said something on the internet, and now she's
the way.
I didn't like it.
I know that your patron saint's Joan of Arc too, so I guess we're in line with our saint, I guess. But like,
right,
yeah,
I was thinking that. I was like, well, I guess Joan got called a sorceress too, so whatever.
Kind of touching on what you were talking about with like the rad trads like objectifying women. Like, I literally saw this TikTok that I'm gonna insert right now. I mean, it's not hilarious, it's disgusting that it's like you tell women to veil, which I do like veiling at mass, but you tell women that
you're gonna tell me to veil because you can't keep it in your pants, but then I veil and then you still want to make lewd comments about me. It's almost like your sense of shame and misdirected sexual impulse is so perverse that there's literally nothing I could do to stop you from being a nasty little pervert.
Literally, well, it's literally like, wow, like this just goes to prove that like you can wear your mantilla, you can wear your veil, you can cover every inch of your skin as a woman, and if somebody wants to objectify you, they will.
Because traddom is totally devoid of mysticism. Like I said, mysticism is all about, it's predicated on the questions as opposed to the answers. There's no mysticism there. So you have people that are it's all predicated on control. It's all predicated on certainty. And that obviously spills over into the sexual impulse, because the church, we kind of screwed over our own mysticism, unfortunately. That's on us. But even in traddom, it's worse. Because if you step out of line even a little bit with any of their blisteringly hot takes that they, claim to be just the word of God or whatever, then, you have to pay hell for it, because they're not psychologically equipped to actually handle the really truly difficult work of becoming a saint. That is difficult work. It's taking on a cross, and that's really the opposite of what they're doing, is that they want to put other people on the cross. They don't want to be on the cross themselves. No, they want to be the one getting to pick and choose who gets executed.
They love to like victimize themselves and like demonize the world. Now, the secular world is a very broken place. I'm not debating that. But it's so ridiculous, like, to be like, oh yeah, like,
I'm sorry. Like, I think I made a post that was just like, you stupid bitch woman, I'm an expert on church history. How dare you contradict me?
it's
And
like
then
you're
I'm like,
14.
but doesn't this thing that you like, wasn't it condemned officially by the church in like the Middle Ages? And they're like, I'm a little baby, I can't weed. Why are you being so mean to me? And it's like, you can't be both.
Always go and they run to like their like internet friends, or they go and they run to Twitter, they go and run to TikTok or wherever they go, and they're just like, I am doing the real work and it is so hard, and it is so hard for me, and the devil is attacking me because this other Catholic had a take that I didn't like and disagreed with mine, so they can't be real Catholics, they're actually just infiltrators. You just need to pray for them, but don't actually pray for them because, they're
pray at them. Pray at them like weird evangelicals do. That's happened to me. I had a trad actually pray at me once. Jesus didn't tell you to pray at people. He told you to pray for them. So chill the fuck out, man. If you're fascinated by like the traditional Catholic aesthetics, like the TLM mass and those kinds of really beautiful aesthetics and imagery, and that's something enticing to you, I would read a book called Meditations on the Tarot by Valentin Tomberg. That's a genuinely robustly traditional Catholic text. And it's problematic in a lot of respects, but it is one of the most profound texts spiritually I think many of us are ever going to read in our lives. And it's one that absolutely affirms the Catholic faith as the faith founded by Christ, and is very, very like vehemently, it's traditional and the true sense of the word, and the true generative sense of the word, as in it wants to truly conserve what is truly alive, what is truly of God in the church.
Yes, definitely. I'll put that in the description box below. I guess for the next question, what do you wish that leftists knew about Catholics? Because I also have a lot of like liberals and left-leaning people who are secular who watch this channel too and are curious about Catholicism.
I think for me, it's the same thing that I wish a lot of Catholics had been taught, which is just the basics, the basic tenets of the faith, the basics of personalism, the basics of the Eucharist, the basic defenses regarding the Eucharist, the basic defenses, the foundations of it. In particular, like I said, read the elaborations on the nature of the Eucharist, and read the elaborations on the nature of the Virgin. Because one of the biggest objections I've heard to people from the outside looking in is that they find the idea of the Virgin being very sexist. And it's not as if like, a lot of people in particular now, these weird trad types, don't cling to that title of the Virgin and distort it as something that's supposed to be like woman sex bad. It's the principle of the Virgin is the mystical principle of chastity, in which the whole human person is continent and directed towards its final endpoint in God, which includes sexually, physically. And the fact that Mary is a virgin is very specifically to show us that the nature of the Trinitarian God is fundamentally different from what mankind understood before it. Mankind understood that, a God could get a woman pregnant through intercourse. We understood demigods, we understood avatars, we understood a lot of things. The fact that Mary conceived as a virgin means that the Trinity, the Spirit, is something fundamentally different from our previous understanding. That the nature of God, the nature of the true source, is so radically different from anything that we've been able to comprehend semiotically up till that point.
That's like a wonderful take. Like I think that something I wish that like more leftists knew about Catholics is that we're not the enemy. Catholics really shouldn't be the enemy of anybody. I mean, they should be the enemy of like horrible ideas maybe, but they shouldn't be the enemy of any person really. When I have spoken to secular leftists, I think that a lot of them seem to have a lot of respect for Pope Francis, and a lot of them have respect for the Catholic social teaching. I think that they get frustrated because they feel like that sometimes they're like, why are you not on the front lines with us? Like when you preach this stuff, like why aren't you standing there beside us? And that's not to say that we haven't stood beside, like, you know, secular left-leaning people or even humanists sometimes in certain causes, like we have, but I think that we wish that there was just more of that.
Praxis, as opposed to, like, you know, falling into the trap of thinking correct belief is enough to save you. It's not. No, correct belief is not enough. Your praxis and your prayer are the same thing. You want those two things to be the same thing.
Like something that happened to me that kind of like I felt convicted when this happened. Like I one time I was in a group of people on Facebook, of course, that it was like a lot of people there had a lot of religious trauma, and they had posted something that was blasphemous against the Eucharist. Now, I corrected them and I was like, you know, this is very offensive to people who are Catholic or people who are Orthodox. And like, I think that I understand you have religious trauma, but this is wrong. And that there are good Catholics within the church. While I still obviously agree with like my correction of like correcting them and stuff on that, because what they were posting was horrible. The comments I got, while they were very mean, I could see that there was genuine pain there. And I felt like that Christ was with them in a way, and that Christ was speaking through them, being like, and it's like, this is a very personal like experience, but it's like, I felt called out, like, what good is it that there's good Catholics when these hurting people don't see them? Where are they? Like, it's not enough for me just to correct somebody in an internet comment. Like, I need to go all the way and do this, you know, Christ thing all the way. Otherwise, it's not enough.
And that's one of the other tensions that you have to live with as a Catholic, is the crimes of the institutional church, and also the immense mystical truth waiting to be unleashed inside of it. Both of these things coexist simultaneously. That is really difficult and really, really painful. But if these people have never actually experienced the Eucharist, then they can't be blaspheming, because they don't actually know what they're blaspheming. Say like, I worship Satan, you know, fuck God or whatever. And it's like, no, they're not actually speaking of the real thing.
I definitely have had some very scary, very bad, you know, experiences with occultists that I have not spoken about publicly for my own safety and for the safety of the people that are involved. For anybody watching this, just please pray for everybody involved in that, and I hope to share those stories eventually. But like, I definitely do agree that a lot of people who say, you know, like Satanist propaganda and stuff, or they blaspheme or attempt to blaspheme against the Eucharist, I don't think they really know what they're doing. That makes it so sad. I was so sad seeing like people like hate on the Eucharist like that, because it's like you're seeing people attack, you know, Christ like at like his most vulnerable, you know, form, and that just was so upsetting to me. But I also understand, and I was called by, you know, Christ himself in the Gospels and stuff to be like, I do have to have compassion for these people, and if I want these people to be impacted by Christ in a positive way, to repent and to have a more proper reverence for the Eucharist, I need to show them Christ's love. I have to be the one to show them that love. How do you think we can end poverty?
I like this question.
I saw your TED Talk, which I'm going to put that in the description box below.
In terms of poverty, there's poverty in the United States, but I always want to emphasize like taking the global perspective in terms of the ramifications and the injustices of extracting wealth from other parts of the world, as America has done. It has to be a two-pronged thing. Obviously, like, we gotta, you know, either eat the rich, or as what G.K. Chesterton said, it's like you can kill the rich or you can enshrine the rich, but you can't trust them. I think the first step to ending poverty is to stop trusting the rich.
Yeah.
Maybe there's individual rich people with a good heart who are trying. We should convert them to the church and to the left, make them class traitors. But stop trusting the rich. Number one, that's your first goal. That's the first thing people need to stop doing. And Americans have been brainwashed into thinking that the rich are like chosen by God. And that is not good programming. The second thing is mutual aid and breaking down the kind of legal barriers to mutual aid and redistribution of land and things like that. Because a lot of the, like in the 30s, during the Great Depression, that was a great time for American socialism. That was a tremendous time for American mutual aid. And in a lot of cases, race barriers were broken down because Blacks and whites and indigenous people were all supporting each other during this really difficult time. And of course, that got stomped on by the America First people who hated the New Deal and went out of their way to make sure Jews who were trying to escape Nazism were turned away on that ship that came. I don't have all the full details of that, but really, first, it's don't trust the rich. Second, it's start doing mutual aid in your own area. Start to build those networks up. And then the third thing is we got to be politically militant. I don't mean political terrorists. Then again, I mean, when you're in a country like this, it's like, the right will define a terrorist as anything they don't like. But we need to be politically militant. This is not the time for the liberal approach is not effective in actually stemming the tide of fascism. It's like, no, we need people to put their bodies on the line. We need people to do de-escalation work in terms of like helping people de-escalate from trauma physiologically. We need people who can do de-radicalization work. So really, I mean, like the third thing is like, we have to actually stem the tide away from fascism. We have to stem the tide away from capitalism, away from the beast that's causing it. We have to starve it out. And I think the fourth thing is we have to start radically changing our ideas of our responsibilities to our neighbors. I mean, one of the reasons why Dorothy Day later in her life, she went back and forth on full-blown communism, but she said that she didn't like the idea of communism in some sense because she did not want the responsibility of people's lives being put on the government. She thought that human beings and neighbors had to learn how to love each other and take care of each other on a personal level. She figured like it's one thing to have the material needs met, but we need our communitarian needs met too, which is 1,000% correct. So it's really ending poverty is really starting like immediately where you are, and doing that work of strengthening mutual aid networks, of becoming a very informed ally to indigenous people, to Black people, to people who are minoritized, and using whatever leverage you have to stand up for them, to speak for these people, because they're not in a position to speak for themselves. A lot of people who are in dire poverty, like they're not in a position to talk to themselves, talk for themselves. So who's going to say something? We got to be the ones to say something. We have to be the ones to actually like shoot straight and call it out. It's all about radical allyship. It's all about destroying the propaganda that the rich have shoved down our throats, that the oligarchy has inundated us with. It's about acting now within the full scope of your own powers. Obviously, we all have limitations, especially after the pandemic. We're all traumatized, but acting within whatever scope of power you have, that is going to be the thing that's going to kill. That's going to like put the stake in the vampiric heart of fucking capitalist stuff and actually like stem the tide away from poverty. It's two-pronged. It's broad policy, but it's also neighborhoods and networks, and reshifting the power structures and the paradigms there of resources.
And I think that also something that people who are interested in left-leaning politics, or for like liberals or just anybody who wants to learn about this stuff, it is also important to note that not all leftists are the same, and that the people that sometimes that you have to work with when you're doing activist work will think differently than you, and that's okay. And we need to, like, we don't want to fall into like a mob mentality thing. I will say though, like you mentioned tankies earlier, like a tanky is like somebody who, I don't know, you probably could define a tanky better than me.
It's more of like an authoritarian communist. Tankies tend to be people who are more, you know, pro, very controversial, authoritarian communist leaders and politicians. You know, I'm not trying to, largely the division between tankies and anarchists in the present moment is exacerbated by the internet. But there's also historical stuff, like in the Spanish Civil War, all the anarchists were killed by the authoritarian communists. I don't have the historical knowledge exactly to comment on that in depth. But, you know, even in the interim, even if there are, you know, some pretty stark differences in like how we're actually going to get to this place that we're trying to get to, there's still a lot of room for the dialectic, you know, between the authoritarian libertarian dialectic, so to speak, which is definitely embedded within the left and the ideologies of the left, and also that runs parallel to the Catholic Church. You know, there is also an anarchist authoritarian dialectic or tension that's built into the faith too. You know, really the point is that even if someone's super problematic, really what you need to suss out is like toxicity, and any number of other things that could make working with them dangerous for you, or that could subvert the purpose of the work that you're doing. Yeah, that's really the big thing for me. Like, there's some more communists on the authoritarian part of the spectrum that I get into arguments with all the time, that I think some of their takes are absolute garbage, but we're still on the same page about what we want to accomplish. We're still on the same page about like what needs to be done. But yeah, for me, like in organizing work, it's really largely like you need to identify, you know, the people who have genuine compassion, for one thing, genuine compassion, people who are willing to dialogue and have your guard up for predatory people or whatever. Because even though the right manufactures predatory people, but the left, like, there's still going to be predators there. There's still going to be opportunists there. So don't think, you know, don't give away to like trust, like, you know, trusting that everyone means what they're saying. You have to have that filter up. And I'm sure a lot of you do. That was something more that I had to learn.
That was something I had to learn too, but like something that like I know is that, I mean, men are still men. And not to say there aren't predatory women too, as there definitely are. Like, I was reading like the testimony of somebody who was sexually assaulted by a very proud Bernie bro, you know, somebody who was very, very gay. Bernie Sanders, awesome. And it's like, so what I'm trying to say is that like always be critical and always have your guard up when you're working with people who are, you know, really, really radical in any sense, because radical means different things to different people, and you need to keep yourself safe. Don't fall into anything that will lead you to sin. That's always what I that's something I always lead with. And like, always be skeptical of any political position, any group of people you're in. Just always be questioning, because also, and questioning's not a bad thing within like a faith community. Questioning, you need to have questioning to have faith, because in my opinion, there's no faith without doubt. And I think that wrestling and having that doubt is a part of having a holy faith process. So yeah, just be careful, guys. I kind of feel like an older sister to my viewers, so I'm always like, oh my gosh, please be careful.
That's the thing about radical allyship, is it's letting go of the idea that you're always right, or that you're right even part of the time, and starting to actually listen and take on far broader and also more specific viewpoints than your own. So like in terms of like the predatory men thing, it's like, just because you're a leftist doesn't mean that you don't have your own trauma and your own built-in ideas that are demeaning or stifling to the women in your life. It's the principle, it's the same principle of humility. It's starting whenever you're doing any kind of social justice work, just like if you're a Christian, it has to start from a place of repentance and brokenness, as in, I'm not always right. I've got some issues, you know, that doesn't make me a bad person. It just makes me human and fallible and limited in my, you know, epistemology of the world and other human beings, and it's starting from that place of like growth and willingness to take feedback and willingness to even take attacks from people who have been hurt, you know, who have knee-jerk reactions of defensiveness or to attack because they've been targeted themselves, and being an agent of a de-escalation and understanding as opposed to feeding into it. It's the same. It's really truly the same thing. You have to start from a place of repentance and a desire for growth, you know.
My next question is, like, how has the church failed and how has it succeeded in helping the poor?
This is such a fascinating question. So in the modern, like in the last 100 years, it's failed quite a bit because it's capitulated to capitalism in a number of topics, and it's taken like, I mean, like it's in some sense it's tried to take like a false centrist approach of like help the poor, but capitalism's cool, I guess. Like, you know, that's not actually going to solve anyone's problems, and it's like it's not actually stepping up to the plate of dealing with the contradictions inherent to capitalism and how they're going to be resolved on behalf of the poor. On the other hand, I mean, if you're looking at like world history, I'm not trying to lump all religions together, obviously, but like, you know, a number of religions across the world pre-Christianity was like, you know, might makes right. Like if you die on a cross, it's like, why would you worship a guy who died on a cross? He lost. That's humiliating. That's disgusting. And Christianity came in and it subverted a lot of those paradigms that, you know, meekness was blessed and, you know, poverty was blessed. And that radical paradigm shift in our understanding of how the world is ordered and structured, that's a big deal. That actually did lead to a lot of radical changes. Like, for instance, you know, when the Catholic Church was spreading, one of the interesting things that I've found, or in what I've read, like was found correlated, was a drastic decrease in incest, and a much more open openness to outsiders, and a greater sense of actual political democracy and educational democracy. So that idea of welcoming the stranger, that kind of radical inclusion that Christ was practicing, that was a big change. That was a very, very big deal. And that did radically shift a paradigm and our consciousness regarding the poor. And the tragedy of, you know, a lot of the secularism or the Enlightenment or any number of these different philosophical revolutions that deprived us of the mystical vision of life, was that it kind of gave an opening for people to get into the faith and start to reverse that work and start to actually degrade that consciousness that we had achieved in regards to the suffering human. You know, I think a lot of the work is actually, it's not trying to do anything new with the church, quote unquote. It's just really constantly returning back to the wellspring of the faith, constantly returning back to the praxis of the early Christians.
But yeah, like what Nietzsche said about like that Christianity is the religion of slaves. I think that what's so revolutionary about Christianity is how it's able to turn our ideas of power like on their heads, you know. Like that was something I always found like appealing about it. I cringe at this because I used to be this. I can't stand when people say I'm not left-leaning or conservative, I'm just Catholic. It's like, that means you're just centrist, which I get it, but like don't
Yeah.
and
it's like, no, like it's not a question of like I'm neither one. It's a question of like I am multiple things, but my Catholicism, you know, by the grace of God, will break through into those things, and I can be the magus with which God uses to revive these things and order them in proper relationship to the rest of the world.
I used to identify as a moderate because I thought that being moderate was the more open-minded way of viewing things, because I thought I was looking at like both sides of the arguments, like the right and the left, and was like taking both. But I realized, you know, as I got older that sometimes you have to take sometimes you have to take a stand for something. And that's something that I agree with for both the right and the left, like for people that are very, very militant conservatives and people that are militant leftists. Like both of those sides, whether you like them or not, they both took a stand on something that they believed was the truth. Like they took like a stand, because there comes a time, and it's like I realized this, like, yeah, as I got older, that like sometimes you can't just stand in the middle and be like, I don't know, I can't choose, or I'm a centrist, or
There comes a point where being moderate actually starts becoming being an enabler. And also the whole thing about being a moderate or a centrist in America is, like I said, we're so skewed to the right, which what we people think of as centrism is like, no, Bernie Sanders and AOC are actual centrists. They're actually even a little right-leaning compared to the global political spectrum. They're not on the left globally. They're slightly, ever so slightly to the right. Actually, like you have to start seeing things on a global scale before you can really say where you're positioned on the political spectrum, because it's like, well, what you're considering, what a lot of people in America consider a communist, like Joe Biden being a communist, it's like Joe Biden is hard on the right from a global perspective. Bernie Sanders and AOC are just faintly right of dead center, practically. Some people would even consider them just straight up on the right. You know what I mean? That's how varied it is. So it's like, before you can say whatever you are, you've got to actually see it globally, as opposed to just in terms of like American politics, because we're not escaping the fact, like America does not, we've been thinking that we're a powerhouse and an island, but especially now with the pandemic, we've been leveled. The world we all need each other. All of us, we're all interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, like you said, like the pandemic has really made the world flat. The internet has made the world flat. This pandemic has allowed for me to make friends with people from all over the world, and that's like all we had. We literally had each other, even though we were all like separated, we were all like together too, in this really bizarre way. And it really did kind of bring more awareness to me about like the importance of global politics and why we need to look at the entire world and not just the United States. So my final question is, what would you recommend for left Caths who feel out of place at their parish?
Oh, that's rough. I would recommend actually going on the internet and beginning to interact and coming into it with a very good filter, obviously. But I would suggest being on Facebook. I mean, I have made some of the most influential friendships of my life through this platform, through this religious community. And the perspectives that you get are so varied and so challenging. It's a tremendous place of growth. Aside from that, also, it's as we're moving out of the pandemic, I think that I would eventually like to meet up with all of these people and start to do the work of reviving parish communities, making them more of a socio-political plurality, as opposed to just these very largely one-note places for either older people or very conservative young people.
I think that I've spoken with so many people who are kind of like spiritual but not religious, and that was like a place that I was once in, so I have a lot of like compassion in my heart for like that point in the spiritual journey, that they've come to me and they're just like, I want to become Catholic, but I'm so scared of like the conservative leaning parishes that are like, because yeah, it's like you said, it's either like the church is full of like one note like elderly folk, or it's filled with like really really radical conservative young people. And that's a result of the traditionalist movement kind of taking over the internet in the early 2000s, and they've continued to kind of hold that monopoly on the internet, on the Catholic internet anyway. So people feel like, is being a left Cath a real way to be Catholic? And I would say for people that have that question or they have those doubts, like, look to Dorothy Day. Like, we've mentioned Dorothy Day multiple times in this conversation, but Dorothy Day was a pacifist and an anarchist, and she was, a progressive her whole life. Like, she was always an anarchist, and she always reconciled her anarchism with her Catholic faith. Even though it seems paradoxical that anarchists would subscribe to a hierarchical institution like the Catholic Church, she did it, and she's a servant of God now, and she's on the path to sainthood. So if she was able to do it, I believe you're able to do it. You living as an example of what a left cath can look like will inspire other people to do the same.
Mm-hmm. When you are out there doing that, you're giving other people permission to do the same thing.
And that's like the beauty of the internet, is that you're able to kind of express yourself, and sometimes you'll mess up, sometimes you'll make mistakes, sometimes you'll be incorrect, but we all have to just have faith that God is using us for a higher purpose. Thank you so much for this conversation, Liz. Anybody, please subscribe to be part of the conversation. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. That really, really helps support the channel monetarily. If you're not in the position to donate monetarily, that's totally okay. You can still support the channel by liking, sharing, or just commenting on my videos. I really, really would appreciate that. And thank you so much to my lovely patrons. You guys inspire me and allow me to do the work that I do. So thank you so much. God bless everybody. Thank you, Liz.
God bless everyone.